The Reinvention of Self CD is information about you. Reinvention literally means to become somebody else. And when we talk about reinventing a new ideal of yourself, we're not talking about buying a new boat or getting a new sports car or buying a new wardrobe or getting plastic surgery. Those type of changes that we make in that sense are taking place from something outside of us. True reinvention happens from within. Now, your personality creates your personal reality. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So the present personal reality that you're living in today, your life, was created from the present personality. Which means if you wanted to create a new personal reality, on a fundamental level, you would have to change your thought processes, you would have to change some aspect of your behaviors or habits, and you would have to alter some emotion that you've memorized that has become part of your identity. Now, one of the biggest problems people have in the process of creation is that they're trying to create a new personal reality by being the same personality. The concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity tells us that we're changed by every thought we think, every dream we conjure up, every possibility that we speculate, anything that we change in terms of behavior and action, any emotion we decide to alter, literally rewires our brain and causes it to fire in new patterns and sequences and combinations. That simple action of change begins to leave footprints biologically in the circuits in our brain that become the very platform of a new identity. By the same means, your ability to create emotions by thought alone, your ability to change your energy, can quite frankly begin to signal new genes in new ways. That concept in biology is called epigenetics, which means that our genes can change just by altering our experiences, by changing our behaviors, by signaling a new genetic expression, by altering some emotion. Now, the way you think and the way you feel creates a state of being. When your thoughts and feelings are aligned or are coherent, we call that a state of being. When your mind and body are working together, you're in a state of being. And your state of being is your personality. So again, in order to change some aspect of our personality, we have to change how we think and feel. Now let's address this from a psychological model. For example, psychology tells us that by the time we're 35 years old, we're pretty much a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions, a set of automatic programs that define who we are. Neuroscientific model tells us that our brains become hardwired by the time we're 35 years old, and the biological model tells us that we signal genes that cause us to head for our genetic destiny. The new model of science tells us that from a psychological standpoint, that we can change some aspect of ourselves to produce different outcomes in our life. For example, let's say that the psychological model says that who you are as an identity is how you think, act, and feel. That your experience of the world is based on past memories, and that those memories begin to forecast or define who you are as an individual. So to change some aspect of ourselves from a psychological model means then that we have to first examine our own thoughts. And if we can pay attention to our own thoughts or think about how we're thinking, begin to notice how we're behaving, and begin to become conscious of how we're feeling, it means then that we can some way modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. So then, according to the psychological model, the moment you have insight about yourself, the moment you have an understanding or a new thought about your state of being, that thought should naturally lead you to a new choice. When you begin to make a different decision about yourself or your life, it means you're going to take a different set of actions. You're going to modify your behavior in some way. You're going to change the way you do something. And if you can get your behaviors to match your intention, you're going to have a new experience. And that new experience then is going to create a new emotion. And that new emotion will begin to redefine you as a new personality. So, let's say that you were diagnosed with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Now, we know as a scientific fact that diabetes, adult onset diabetes, is actually changeable. And so you learn a bit of knowledge because you read the latest research that says if you change your lifestyle, if you change your behaviors, if you change your choices, that those cells that normally produce insulin that get tired or malfunction could actually be rejuvenated. But it's dependent on the things that you do. So you read this article, you gain some new insight, you gain a little bit of new knowledge, and you say, okay, what are the things that we have to do in order to begin to produce different effects? Okay, I have to eat certain foods. I'll have to exercise a certain amount of time, at least 4 to 5 days a week. I'll have to avoid certain stressors in my life. And as people begin to gather this information, they're literally creating a new mind. When they make a choice to do something with what they learned, it makes sense then that the new choice is going to create a new behavior. And when they begin to make different choices around the foods they eat, and they make different choices about amount of exercise or movement that they partake in, and they begin to learn how to shorten the refractory period of their emotional responses to stressors in their life, that the research says that between 1 week and 4 to 8 weeks, people will begin to change their expression of diabetes. Now, when they begin to make those changes, it makes sense then they're going to begin to have new experiences. They're going to begin to lose weight. They're going to begin to feel better about themselves. Their body's going to begin to have more energy. And all of those new experiences then produce different emotions. They start to feel more self-esteem. They start to feel better about themselves. They begin to make other choices then that begin to lead to other lifestyle changes. And you see the person climbing out of their particular state of mind and body. Now, from a biological or neuroscientific model, because of the concept of neuroplasticity, it means then if a person wants to change something about themselves, there's a similar application. Let's say a person wants to become happy. In other words, they no longer want to be sick. Well, the first step in becoming happy is to first examine why you're unhappy. What are the thoughts that you pay attention to, that you give your energy to, that define you as an unhappy person, that make you feel depressed? What are the behaviors that you consistently reproduce until they become habits, to the point where you go unconscious, that creates certain emotions to reaffirm an identity of who you think you are, which is depressed or low self-esteem or unworthy? Now, if you can begin to examine those very aspects of the way you think, act, and feel, that examination, that ability to pay attention to the self, does an amazing thing. It begins to restrain certain circuits in your brain from firing. And the principle in neuroscience says nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. So every time you inhibit a thought, every time you restrain an impulse or a behavior or reaction, and every time you notice an emotion and you shorten the refractory period of that response, you're causing jungles of neurons to no longer electrically fire in the same patterns. In other words, you're beginning to change your mind, because as you begin to control the circuits from firing in familiar ways, you begin to weaken their connections. And if every place where one neuron is connected to another neuron is called a memory or a thought, in time you begin to prune away the very fabric of your old identity. Now, if you can take this step a little bit further, and you begin to see that how you think and how you feel creates a state of being, which is an identity or a personality. If you're able to control the very thought processes that create a level of mind that either produces a behavior or automatically produces an emotional response, every time you inhibit those circuits from firing, you're stopping a chemical in the form of a feeling from signaling your body. As you begin to make the effort to stop that process from occurring, your body now no longer gets the same emotional quotient that keeps pushing the same gene that causes you to head to your genetic destiny. And as you inhibit those emotions, in time, you begin to pull the mind out of the body or no longer recondition the body to the same mind. And the body, as the unconscious mind then, no longer begins to believe it's living in the same condition that's created the same emotion. What I mean by that is your body is the servant to your mind. It is an objective observer, and it doesn't know the difference between the experiences in your life that create emotions and the emotions you fabricate by thought alone. So if you're experiencing the same emotion every single day because you're thinking a certain thought that produces a certain feeling, and the moment you begin to feel that feeling, it drives more of the same thoughts, which causes the same feelings, that when you get in this continuous loop of thinking and feeling in that same cycle, your body begins to believe that it's living in the past experiences that created that emotion 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. And over time then, the body literally begins to live in the past because it becomes the mind. As you're able to gain control of those feelings that drive you to a lower denominator, as you inhibit those, you're no longer signaling the same gene in the same way, and the epigenetic phenomenon begins to take place, which means the body begins to become liberated from the past. This is when we begin to see a whole new landscape of possibility. Now, what does the quantum model of reality tell us about our ability to change? Well, if all potentials exist simultaneously in the quantum field, and all those potentials exist only in the present now moment, then you and I have come with all the machinery and all the biological hardware to practice being present. But if we're continuously unfolding past bitter memories that are tattooed in the recesses of our gray matter, and by attention we bring them to life, and to that moment it is real, the body begins to believe it's living in the past. And if we begin to forecast some worst-case scenario, and we obsess about that outcome to the exclusion of everything else, in time that thought will literally become the experience in our mind, and our body, as the unconscious mind, will begin to believe it's living in some future event. When we train our mind and body to live in the present, we have access to other potentials. Now, thoughts are electric, and feelings are magnetic. And you generate electromagnetic fields by how you think and feel. Now, all those potentials that exist in the quantum field simultaneously exist as electromagnetic potentials. And when you can change your energy, your frequency signature, to match a frequency or an energy electromagnetically that already exists in the quantum field, when you can tune into abundance, when you can tune into health, when you can tune into joy, and you can begin to match the signature of that electromagnetic potential with the signature of what you're generating in the present moment, be prepared, because that's the moment reality begins to change and you begin to live in a whole nother line of time. We could say then that the experience finds you, or your body's drawn to that event. So from a psychological model, biological model, neuroscientific model, or quantum model, we have the permission to change at any time in our life. Once we understand how to do it, once we understand the science of what it means to do it, then we give ourselves permission to do the uncommon. And then the reinvention of self becomes as natural and easy as anything else we do. In fact, you already know how to do this. You just haven't made it a habit.
Question 1. Can you tell us what is the role of the frontal lobe in the process of creation or reinvention?
There are 3 basic functions of the frontal lobe that I want to talk about. The frontal lobe is the crowning achievement of the human being. It's what separates us from all other species on the planet. Your frontal lobe is 40% of your entire brain. Think of your frontal lobe as the brain's CEO, as the brain's symphony leader, as the brain's designer. And the first function of the frontal lobe is that when you're truly paying attention and you're truly focused, when you're learning something new, or you're speculating outcomes, or you're in the process of reinventing a new idea, you don't want to be distracted by anything else. So the frontal lobe acts like a volume control, and it begins to put all of your attention on a single-minded thought and lowers the volume to information that's coming from your body, sensory information, your stomach, the pain in your leg, whether you feel your body sitting on a chair or standing up. It lowers the sensory information coming from the environment through your senses, everything you're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling, hearing. Those circuits shut off in your brain. And if those circuits shut off and there's no longer any brain activity there, there's no longer a mind to process anything in your environment. It cools off the circuits in your brain that have to do with time. And so for a moment, we lose track of time and space. When the brain functions in this way, the thought that you're thinking about literally becomes the experience, and you begin to wire that information neurologically in your brain to look like the event has already happened. Now this begins to allow us to install some additional circuits so we have some raw materials to use in our life. Now here's an example. Let's say you were going to learn how to dance the salsa, or build a doghouse, or learn about the traits and characteristics of a successful person. What did they do to become wealthy? As you begin to learn this information, and you're sitting down reading it, as you're gathering all this data, you're forging new connections in your brain. That's what learning is. As you stop and you pause and contemplate on what you learn and you review and remember everything you just read, you begin to reinforce those circuits in your brain, and those new additional circuits will begin to cause your brain to work in new and unusual ways. And every time you revisit and review and begin to think about how you can apply all that information and make different choices, and as you begin to put yourself into the equation of that knowledge, the moment you do that, you're beginning to organize a new level of mind that's beginning to become an aspect of your new identity. So, if you're not paying attention and you're reading a book or learning something new and your brain is bouncing from one thing to the next, it's very simple to see then that your inability to stay focused or your need to be distracted doesn't allow the circuits to form and solidify that become the very platform of your actions. So the more focused and more concentrated we are, the greater our ability to begin to cause the brain to upscale its circuitry. Now, when we lower the volume to time and space because we're learning something new, or we're attending to something we want, or we are picking some future reality that we want to experience, and we're reviewing how we're going to get there, there comes a moment when you're truly focused and truly paying attention that you forget about yourself. You actually disappear in the process. And when you forget about yourself, the moment you're no longer that old identity self, the moment you have lost track of who you think you are, when you reach that elegant moment and you're no longer thinking and feeling in the same cycle, we could say that the moment the identity is gone, nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together, Every time you reach this moment, that creative moment where you lose track of time and space, you're literally breaking down the very neuroscientific circuits that have defined you as an identity. By the same means, you're no longer signaling the same genes in the same way because you're no longer thinking and feeling in the same way. And the more we put our energy behind the creative process and we have these moments, the more the old self begins to break away, and the more we begin to flourish into a new self. Now, the second function of the frontal lobe is this concept in neuroscience called metacognition. Now, metacognition, we've mentioned at the beginning of the CD in a roundabout way, but it is your ability to think about your thoughts. It's your brain's frontal lobe that can begin to review your behaviors, to notice your emotions. And the whole reason that we can pay attention to those different aspects of ourselves with such an enlarged forebrain is so that we can begin to modify our behaviors to produce different outcomes in our life. So, if you want to change something about yourself, and we said earlier on that if you wanted to become happy, the first thing you have to do is notice why you're unhappy or stop being unhappy. And if you're going to stop being unhappy, then you're going to have to pay attention to the thoughts that you unconsciously let go by your awareness on a daily basis that go by unnoticed, that cause you to begin to feel certain ways, that which then cause you to act in very predictable and routine behaviors. And your ability to notice those things begins to objectify your subjective mind. In other words, you're no longer being that person when you're observing it. And that process of observation, that process of metacognition, begins to separate ourselves from the old self. This idea is one of the first steps in recognizing what aspect of yourself that you want to change. For example, most people would say, well, I am this way because of my mother or my father or my culture or this experience that's happened in my past. And they excuse themselves from changing because it's very easy to say, there's something outside of me that caused me to feel this way. Now, in the metacognitive process, we have to go beyond that insight. We may say, yeah, that when I had this experience, that's the moment I got knocked out of balance, and I haven't been able to make my way back to that kind of remembrance of a greater sense of self. When we begin to have that kind of insight, the next thing to look at is, well, the only way that I'm going to change this is to begin to denature or to begin to break down the very fundamental aspects of my identity. And now we begin to call power back to us because we're no longer saying it's that person or that thing or that experience that caused me to be this way. We begin to say, I'm going to change some aspect inside of me. And when I overcome that emotion or that attitude or that behavior, and I free myself from the chains of the past, I can look back at that experience without the emotional charge. And when we can look back at experiences in our life without having the strong emotional quotient with it, that's called wisdom. And when we have that freedom to overcome that aspect of ourself or some part of our identity, and we liberate ourselves from being connected to that past experience, that level of understanding then causes us to evolve our actions and be free from the past. We could say that the past literally rolls up to the present. Now, the last function of the frontal lobe is that it is a great gatherer to create new archetypes, new designs, new paradigms, new visions, new vistas, new probabilities. It speculates future potentials that already exist in the quantum field. So, as you begin to ask yourself important questions like, I think I want to become somebody else, so how would a great person think? How would a great person act? What does wealth feel like? What does love feel like? What qualities and characteristics of people that I admire could I be like, and what would I have to change about myself? As you start asking these types of questions, which I call frontal lobe questions, you begin to activate the forebrain. And your symphony leader, the brain's CEO, which has connections to all other parts of the brain, begins to look out over the landscape of your entire brain. And what it wants to do is it wants to gather all the knowledge and all the experience that's stored in your brain and seamlessly piece it together to create a new vision or a new dream. So it says, geez, I read that book on success, or I read that book on loving relationships. I read that article in the magazine that gave me a little bit more knowledge. I've had these experiences. I know these people. I've seen that movie. I have relationships with people that are successful. And what the frontal lobe does is it begins to gather all of these different neurological networks in your brain and piece them together to fire in a very big sequence that creates a new level of mind, which then creates a vision in your brain equal to the knowledge and experience that you have. And when you attend to that vision and you put your energy behind it, there comes a moment that it becomes so crystal clear that you have very strong intention. Now, when you have that strong intention, when you begin to review it and become possessed by it, if you keep doing it, as we said, one of the other functions is that you'll lower the volume to time and space, and that intention will literally become an experience, and you'll begin to think about what it would feel like when it occurs. The moment the thought becomes the experience, the end product of an experience is called a feeling or an emotion, you begin to signal your body emotionally to a new mind. And your body, as the unconscious mind, does not know the difference between the actual event and the emotion you're fabricating in that moment. We could say that your body is literally living in that future reality now, and you're moving into a new state of being. So, you have to agree then that the more knowledge you have, the more information you learn, the more you wire new data into the circuits of your gray matter, and the more you can become plastic enough to begin to ask those bigger questions and allow your brain to imagine outcomes, the more you're able to mix up those circuits to create different levels of mind, then it is a direct function then of your ability to pay attention, to become creative and speculate possibilities, gather information to create bigger archetypes or bigger models of reality, and then to review them enough times till the thought literally wires in your brain neurologically, which means you install the hardware. Allow the thought to become the experience then, which begins to signal your body epigenetically to turn on new genes in new ways to the point where your body begins to change ahead of the actual event. Now, when your brain and body are changed to look like the event has already happened, that means the event has already happened. It means then there's physical evidence that your body and brain look like it already had the experience. Now, the moment this happens, according to the quantum model of reality, it means the event has already happened. And when we can let go and live in this present state of being, or another way to say it, memorize this state of being, and we can maintain that modified state of mind and body our entire day. In other words, by you being somebody else, you're a new personality. A new personality now creates a new personal reality. And when you are maintaining that modified state of mind and body in the same energy that you created that identity with, hang on, because that's when the event finds you. And it will always come in a way that you least expect. Why? Because if you can expect it, it's really nothing new. It has to come in a way that's unpredictable, that surprises you, that catches you off guard and leaves no doubt that what change you made inside of you produced some result outside of you. And the energy of that experience then inspires you to do it again, again, and again.
Question 2. How important is the practice of basic meditation and/or mental rehearsal as an aid to reinvention?
Now, one of my favorite things to do is to demystify the mystical. I love to take abstract concepts and begin to use science as the contemporary language of mysticism to begin to make it practical enough that every single person has at their very fingertips the ability to apply it in some aspect or some measure in their life. So the word meditation, if you look up the word meditation in Tibetan texts, the very literal translation of the word meditation means to become familiar with. The symbol means to become familiar with or to make known. Now let's think about this. 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions that create an identity subconsciously. So 5% of your conscious mind that is plugged into reality is working against 95% of what you memorized subconsciously. So you can, pray with all of your intention to have a great life. But if you've memorized guilt because you've been thinking and feeling in the same cycle, we could say that mind wants one thing and body wants another. And if the body has become the mind, for the most part, we return back to the same self. Now, since those automatic programs exist in an operating system subconsciously, it becomes very difficult to use our conscious mind to change these programs. As a matter of fact, using the conscious mind to try to change these programs that run automatically, it would be like when you're working on your computer and all of a sudden a bunch of programs begin to function uncontrollably. By you using your conscious mind, it would be like you stopping and yelling at the computer, asking it to stop. You're separate from the operating system. That's what it's like to use the conscious mind in order to change. Now, the meditative process, the word meditation means to become familiar with. The moment you use that concept called metacognition and you eliminate your external environment, you're no longer picking up all that sensory data from your outer world. You're not seeing people or seeing objects or things. You're not going to places and recognizing familiar associations with your job or your desk, and you're not re-experiencing the same routine behaviors. As you're sitting still and you're eliminating the environment by closing your eyes and playing soft music or sitting in a dark room, the change in sensory information causes you to notice that the internal environment now is becoming as real as the external environment. And as you sit there and you're no longer distracted by your external world, it makes sense then that all of a sudden you can notice, pay attention to, observe, or become conscious of those subconscious programs. You can begin to notice your thoughts and pay attention to them to such a degree that they begin to become familiar to you. And as you begin to recognize and see certain impulses, certain cravings, and certain behaviors that your body wants to automatically do and is driven to do them, and you're sitting there and you notice that those behaviors were only to create an emotion to reaffirm an identity of who you thought you were, and you begin to objectively look at those behaviors and you see yourself like reviewing your life. As you begin to notice them and you separate yourself from being them, we could say then, who's doing the observing of those programs? That's the conscious awareness of who you really are. And if you can begin to recognize those feelings that create the emotions of anger, or judgment, or hatred, or frustration, of insecurity, of pain, of suffering, of hopelessness, of guilt, of shame, and you're watching your body craving some experience or some emotion because it's sending signals back to your brain to reaffirm an identity, and you're becoming so familiar with them, we could say that to know thyself, or in this process of observation, you're becoming familiar with so many aspects of your old self that you would never let those unconscious states of mind and body go by unnoticed by you. Now that is meditation. Now most people would rather turn on the TV, get on the computer, get on the phone, do something to distract them from those feelings that they're normally distracted by. The inward journey to overcome these aspects of ourselves and become so familiar with them means that you're getting into the operating system of the subconscious and beginning to bring them into your conscious awareness so that you have dominion over them. Now, by the same means, meditation also means to become familiar with a new self. And as you begin to sit there and you think about a greater expression of your personality or a greater way to be, and you've read a couple books, you've seen a couple videos, you've got your mind thinking in different ways than it typically does, and you begin to plan a new way of being, and you begin to rehearse mentally a new aspect of yourself. The moment you speculate a new outcome, you're making your brain work in new and different ways. And whenever you make your brain work differently, you're changing your mind. Mind is the brain in action, or mind is the brain at work. So as you reproduce a new level of mind, nerve cells that fire together wire together. And as you consistently review this new ideal of yourself, you begin to install the very circuits that will become the very stage of your new identity. And every day that you remind yourself who you want to be, in time it will begin to become familiar to you. Now, if you can allow the thought that you're thinking about to become the object of your affection to the exclusion of everything else, and that frontal lobe turns on, and that thought begins to become the experience, you're going to begin to feel like that new identity ahead of the actual event. In other words, you're signaling new genes epigenetically, and as you begin to turn on new genes ahead of the actual experience, your body is beginning to be reconditioned to a new mind, and it's beginning to change physically to look like the event is already taking place, or that you're already that new future you in that present moment. So, if you can reproduce the same emotional state from an elevated state of mind and body and remind yourself every day, pretty soon that emotion will begin to become familiar to you. So, in the process of meditation, we have to unlearn some aspect of ourselves and relearn some new aspect of ourselves. We have to break the habit of the old self and reinvent a new self. We have to prune synaptic connections connected to an old mind and flourish and sprout new connections that are connected to a new future. We have to let go of the past and begin to invest in a new future or a new destiny. We have to unmemorize an emotion that's been existing in the body, then recondition the body to a new mind or new emotion. We have to lose our mind and create a new one. We have to change our energy from the past to the energy of the future. Now, I always say that in a meditation, that if you got up or if you get up as the same person who sat down, then nothing's happened to you neurologically, nothing's happened to you biologically, nothing's happened to you chemically, nothing's happened to you genetically, nothing's happened in the quantum field because you're getting up as the same personality. You have to get up as somebody else. Now, some people would say to me, well, I really don't feel like it. And I would say, well, what emotion have you memorized from some past experience that's lingered into a mood and then ultimately into a temperament and finally into a personality trait? What emotion have you memorized that's connected to some past event that's become part of your identity that you wear so well, and you've conditioned your body to be the mind of that emotion, that you can't get beyond it in order to feel an elevated emotion that's connected to a new future? And if you say to me, well, I'm too tired, or I'm too busy, or I had a argument with my boss 3 or 4 days ago, or, I have a pain in my back, and we use those type of excuses or those feelings as a barometer for change, we'll always talk ourselves out of possibility. So in the meditative state, first getting into the operating system of the subconscious and becoming familiar with those, for example, thoughts, actions, and emotions that make us unhappy, and bring them to our awareness so we have control over them in our waking day, that they don't slip by unnoticed by us, and then to begin to rewire a new mind that's connected to a new personality, that's connected to a new identity, and bring up the feelings of how that identity would feel, is conditioning the body to a new mind. And when you get up, when mind and body are working together, when your thoughts and feelings are aligned to a new destiny, now you're in a new state of being. And the quantum field responds to who you're being, not just what you're thinking or just what you're feeling. The combination of how you think and feel, or what we call a state of being. Now, there was an experiment done a little ways back by the HeartMath Institute, where they took a group of expert prayers, and prayer is a skill just like anything else. And they asked these people to take 3 vials of DNA and hold them in their hand and picture in their mind, get a very clear intention of unwinding or rewinding the DNA. And intention is just getting clear on what you want, just getting focused on what you want. And they had these people do the experiment over and over again with intention, over and over again, over and over again. And at the end of the experiment, when they checked the effects of thought alone through intention did nothing to change the DNA. By the same means, they asked these people then to move into an elevated mood, to begin to experience goodwill or gratitude or an elevated emotion of joy. And they had them radiate this feeling out into the field and just radiate it out through the DNA. And they did it over and over again, and when they checked the effects of the DNA, when these people moved into an elevated state, the elevated emotion did nothing energetically to change the DNA. In other words, an elevated emotion alone had no direction. But then when they asked these people to move into an elevated emotion of how they would feel if the DNA unwound, and to give thanks before the actual event occurred, while at the same time holding a very clear intention of what they wanted, seeing the DNA unwind, 25% of the DNA unwound. So when I say thoughts are electric and feelings are magnetic, then the thought and the feeling creates an electromagnetic field that begins to influence every single avenue of our life. So then, if you're getting up every single day as the same personality, the same state of being, you're broadcasting the same electromagnetic signature that keeps you in the present line of time or the present reality that you live in. If you can begin to move into an elevated state of mind and body, into a new state of being, and when your signature electromagnetically begins to become so tuned and so coherent to match a potential reality that exists electromagnetically in the quantum field, when your signature of wealth matches that signature of potential wealth and you tune into it, there's a good possibility that something will show up differently in your life, because now you are a new being, and the field responds then by organizing events in your life that are just right for you. If you get up as the same person every single day and expect something different to show up in your life, and you're thinking the same thoughts and performing the same actions and living by the same emotions, that's not the quantum law of reality. Nothing can show up equal to the old self. So you can't say, how come I'm not successful? How come my prayers aren't answered? How come the quantum law isn't working for me? As the same personality. The new personality would never even ask that. They would be too busy being. Now, the definition of meditation, according to Sanskrit texts, the word means to cultivate self. To cultivate a new self. So you can imagine these holy men and women, these mystics living in the Himalayas, and they come out of these caves and they come down through the fertile valleys, and there's these farmers working in the valleys there, tilling their crops, and these saints and mystics are performing miracles. They're healing the sick. They're manifesting opportunities. They're changing objective world by their subjective mind. And these simple people say to them, "How in the world do you do that?" And they say, "You have to cultivate self." What that means is you have to dig up the old self and plant a new self. And so if you were to think about planting a garden, if you were to plant a garden and you left the plants from the past year and you kept the weeds that had grown because you didn't pay attention to them, and you saw the rocks that had sifted to the surface in the off-season that blocked the surface of the garden, and that the soil was hard and it was never tilled and fertilized, and you cast those seeds, those dreams, on that soil, we could see that we would bear very little fruit. But if you pulled out the plants of the past year, the old dreams of the past, you pulled out the weeds of those stray thoughts that blocked your potential, that crowded your potential. You removed the stones and boulders that got in the way, that blocked who you were. And you began to break the soil down and fertilize it. And now you planted a garden. We could see then that by cultivating up the old self and planting a new self, we would have a very different outcome. Well, the neuroscientific, biological, quantum psychological model says the same thing. We have to make room energetically for a new self. We can't create a new personal reality by being the same personality, because that personality is completely connected to some past aspect of ourselves that we remember. And then we try to forecast and predict some future reality based on our memory of the past, and we miss the present moment. So then the process of meditation is to begin to change your energy. It is to begin to no longer rely on the external world to control how we think and feel. It's to eliminate the external environment and begin to change how we think and feel independent of the environment, independent of our body's needs, and independent of time. And when we can execute this properly, there should be measurable effects in terms of feedback in our life. Now, here's the beauty behind all of this. You and I have been conditioned and hypnotized into believing that we need a reason for joy, that we need a reason for gratitude. We need a reason to fall in love with life. That's a very primitive model of cause and effect, something outside of us producing some chemical change or neurological change inside of us. And the moment we notice that we feel differently inside of us, we pay attention to whoever it was or whatever it was that caused the change. That's a very primitive Newtonian model of reality. In other words, when you give thanks for your family, you give thanks for your job, you give thanks for your home, you give thanks for your health. You're giving thanks for things that are already existing in your reality, and you determine that reality through your senses. The quantum model says you have to give thanks for the event ahead of the actual event, because when you're in a state of gratitude or in love with your creation, or you're overjoyed with the possibility of how you would feel when it happened, now you are conditioning your body into believing that that future reality is happening to you now. And as the brain and body begin to accept this paradigm, then you're living in that future now. And because there's physical evidence, as changes recorded physically in your body, it means then the event has already happened. And now you can surrender to a greater mind. You can allow the field to organize events in your life in a way that's just right for you.
Question 3. How does the law of attraction function in the quantum field, And how is it possible for our thoughts to create our reality?
I want to talk about this phenomenon that takes place right around the middle of our life. We reach a certain point by our mid-30s or early 40s where we've pretty much experienced most of what life has to offer. We've experienced relationships, we've experienced sexuality, we experienced success and failure, we've experienced pain and suffering and food and social interactions. By the time we're in our late 30s and early 40s, we've experienced most of what reality has to offer, and because of that, we can predict, for the most part, the experience of how everything's going to feel ahead of the actual event. Now, this is a tragedy for human beings because we realize that because we can predict how everything's going to feel and we can't generate any new feelings, we become bored with our life. Now, early on in our life, when we're children, we've all been subjected to some rough conditions. We've all had experiences that have branded us emotionally, and we have allowed those emotions to define a certain aspect of ourselves. But what most people do when they have those experiences emotionally that become the foundation of their personality, we get busy with our life. We go to school, we move away from home, we study certain things, we get in relationships, we travel around a little bit, we meet new people, we get married, we get divorced, we have kids in between, we accumulate things, we buy a house, we sell a house, we buy a car, we buy another house. We could say then we use the environment to distract us from some of those early feelings that we have in our life. And because of this, there's a gap that's created between how we appear to the world and who we really are on the inside. If you would take one hand and place it right above your forehead, we could say that that is how you appear to the world. That's the identity, the image, the facade that you direct by your ability to associate with people you know, the things that you do, the things that you own, the places you've lived, the experiences you've had. Your identity is a reflection of the environment that you lived. And for the most part, everything that you possess in your life or have experienced is wired in your brain and emotionally conditioned in your body, and we call that the autobiographical self. Now, if you were to take your other hand and place it at your belly button, we could say that's how you really feel on the inside. And for most people, they don't want to look at that feeling, so for the first 35 years or 40 years of their life, they can become distracted by their external environment so that they don't have to feel this feeling. And things go really well until we've pretty much learned about everything in the environment, and nothing new in our environment is going to create many new feelings because we know how everything's going to go. Now, this moment is kind of interesting because if we look at it in terms of the quantum, and we can predict the feeling of any experience, what we're really saying is we already know our future based on our past, and if that experience comes up where we can't predict the feeling of it, most people will not take the chance because that unpredictable moment is too uncertain, so they would rather crave the familiar so that they don't have the discomfort of not knowing the unpredictable. So this is where the road turns in on itself, because now all of a sudden nothing's making that other feeling go away that's at the bottom hand, how you really feel on the inside. So this is what we call the midlife crisis. This is the moment where we look down at that feeling, and for certain people, they begin to ask some important questions. This is when the soul wakes up. This is when the personality is at its end. It's at its finite set of programs. It's a signature neurologically in the brain. It's a state of being emotionally. And this is where the soul begins to become restless, and it starts asking important questions like, who am I? What does this all mean? What is God? What is this all for? What is the purpose in life? What is love? And when a person begins to look down at that feeling that they've been running from their whole life, and they start telling the truth on how they really feel, and they start telling people in their life they never loved them, they don't know what love is, they don't want to go to those parties any longer because those people are boring, they start to tell the truth about their life, they start breaking all the emotional contracts with everybody that shares the same experiences in their life and thus shares the same emotions. And as they begin to get to this point and tell the truth about who they are, it becomes very uncomfortable for everybody around them because they begin to hurt their feelings. Now, the moment this happens, most of the time, the people in our life that love us take us to the doctor, and the doctor gives us Prozac, and whoops, we return right back to that same facade, that same identity. That's the ideal that we live for the world. The other hand, at the bottom, is the ideal that we really want to live for ourselves, but we're too busy creating an identity that we can identify with our environment with. Now, other people, they don't want to look at that feeling because there's too much to lose. So what they do is they start accumulating more things in their environment. They buy the sports car, a new thing. They lease a boat, another new thing. They go on vacation to a new place. They join a social club where they meet new people that are important. And when the novelty of all of these things wears off, that feeling returns again. So they make an attempt to re-identify with their environment by collecting more possessions, but in a sense, they become possessed by their possessions. Now, all of this is an innate ability to want to change. This is the innate quality within every human being that they want to make some aspect or some feeling about themselves go away. This is a critical moment in our life, and if people can't use their environment externally to make the feeling go away, this is the point where people start going to the next level. This is where they start using drugs and alcohol addictions. In other words, I'm going to take something, I'm going to do something, I'm going to gamble, I'm going to shop, I'm going to overeat, I'm going to undereat, I'm going to video game, I'm going to use pornography, I'm going to do anything to make the feeling go away. And the moment we notice that that feeling can go away by us doing something outside of us, like taking a drug or gambling or shopping, the emotional change that's created from that event causes the pain to disappear, and we pay attention to whatever it was or whoever it was that caused it. That association, that identification, in and of itself is called a memory. And so we become attached to these things, again, with an innate desire to make that feeling go away. Now, the problem is that the receptor sites on the outside of those cells become desensitized. In other words, when you gamble and you spend $5,000, or you shop and you spend $2,500, the next time you shop, the next time you gamble, the next time you take a drug, the receptor sites don't function the same way. They need a stronger hit or a stronger impulse to turn them on. So now you have to spend $6,000 when you gamble, or $7,000, or $4,000 when you shop, or you have to take more of a drug to turn on the same rush of chemistry. And this is what we call an addiction, because what the person's doing is they've memorized an emotion and they're trying in some way to make that feeling go away. Now, when our life ends and the environment disappears, what goes with the environment is that top hand, how you appear to the world. What remains is how you really feel. And until we begin to look at these feelings that define us and begin to observe them and begin to transmute them into something else, we could have been the richest person, the most successful person, the smartest person, the most popular person, the most beautiful person. If we never close the gap between how we appear and who we are, we haven't evolved in that lifetime, because that emotion keeps us connected to some past experience. When we begin to unmemorize those emotions, and when we begin to close the gap between how we appear and who we are, that emotion that's stored in the body is literally energy compressed in the body as emotion. And when we begin to overcome our pain or our emptiness or our fear, and we take that same energy and transmute it or change it for some elevated emotion, when the body is no longer living by those emotions of survival, those stressful emotions of fear and anxiety and pain and suffering, when there's true liberation from the addiction of those emotions, the side effect is true joy because the body is liberated energetically from the chains of the past. Now that energy that's created by your transformation is literally the energy that you use to create a new destiny with. That is available energy for you now to be a quantum observer of your life. So, the law of attraction then, most people, what they try to do is accumulate more things, and they say, when I have this car, when I have this success, when I have this life, then I'll be happy, then I'll be joyful, then I'll have a new identity. And the quantum model says, not until you look down on that emotion and overcome it and unmemorize it will you ever find wholeness, because as you begin to remove those layers of those emotions that have blocked the flow of spirit or that innate intelligence within you, that quantum observer that lives within every human being, until you begin to unmemorize that emotion, the flow of that intelligence is blocked. However, as you begin to remove the veils or the masks of that identity, that intelligence begins to bleed or leak out of us. It begins to move through us. And when that happens, our nature becomes its nature. Our mind becomes its mind. That is when we become more giving, more loving, more conscious, more willful, because that is the mind of this intelligence. So, when we look to see then, when we overcome some aspect of ourselves and we're liberated emotionally, the body no longer lives in the past, and it is free from the constraints of those past emotions that have enslaved it into such pain. And that is when we have greater energy to begin to design a new destiny with. So people would say, well, how does the law of attraction work then? Well, the law of attraction works when you're happy for no reason. When you've overcome some aspect of yourself and you no longer want because you're so whole, that's the moment that it happens. So our purpose in life then really is not to be beautiful or important or wealthy or successful or pretty or any of those things, or to please God even. Our purpose in life is to express this intelligence through us. And until we look at those emotions that we've memorized that cause us to keep returning back to the same self, we can never create a new personal reality being the same personality. We have to unmemorize those emotions, and when how we appear is who we are, we're completely transparent. And the energy now that has been existing in the body of the mind is now liberated energy for us to create with. And so right on the other side of our fear is courage. It's the same energy. Right on the other side of our doubt is certainty, transmuted energy. Right on the other side of our anger is compassion, just liberated energy. Right on the other side of our insecurity is wholeness, just a greater expression of energy. So when we reach this point in our life, the innate desire then is to realize that there's some aspect that really wants to change. And to look outside of us for change is to live separate from this great intelligence. When we look inside and we begin to unmemorize and recognize those habituations and those emotions that drive us to familiar attitudes, and we begin to prune them away and unmemorize them and release the gene that is beginning to cause our body to become physically changed, that's the moment that the mind and body reorganize itself to a new destiny.
This concludes Session 1 of the Reinvention of Self with Dr. Joe Dispenza. This program continues with Session 2. Question 4. What is the process of surrendering to a greater mind?
Now, I always say there is a delicate balance between intention and surrender. Intention is just getting clear on what we want, as we said. Surrender is allowing us to experience the emotion of what it would feel like ahead of the actual event. And when we surrender to that emotion without trying to figure out how the event is going to happen or when it's going to happen, This is when we're trusting in an outcome. We're trusting in the unseen, and we're not using our senses to determine reality. In other words, we're not analyzing, we're not fretting, we're not trying to figure out, we're not using our thinking brain, our analytical mind to get in the way of the outcome of that destiny. So the male brain is highly wired for intention. Men are single-minded, they're hunters, they're activity-driven. When they get a vision or an idea, immediately they get their behavior to match their intention, and because of their single-mindedness, their brain is wired for intention. Now, the female brain is wired for surrender, that because women in antiquity took care of the young and the old, that they were caregivers in a sense, and they took care of the community. Whenever they had to make a decision about something, they always considered the whole in making the decision. So in their mind, they would review every potential experience and then allow themselves to feel what it would feel like in every one of those experiences. And then they would pick an experience that produced an elevated emotion that would allow the protection or the survival of the clan or the community. And so women can very easily resonate with future potentials emotionally because that's what they were genetically driven to do. Now, the balance is two halves making a whole. We need intention to get clear on what we want, and then we have to surrender to that destiny and energetically live in the state of mind as if it has already happened, and we allow ourselves to unfold into this mind, and this is when new and unusual events begin to happen. Now, living by that analytical mind, driven by some of the lower emotions that we've talked about, anger and frustration and aggression and depression and sadness and insecurity and fear, those limited emotions, when we're living from those lower vibratory emotional states, we're always trying to control the outcome of how the event is going to happen, because the chemicals of stress or the chemicals of survival are very, very strong chemicals that endorse the ego to become very selfish, to become very self-involved, very self-centered, very self-indulgent. All the focus is on the self because those survival chemicals cause us to focus on three things: the body, the environment, and time. When an organism in nature is threatened in its environment, it's always concerned about taking care of its body. It's concerned about where in the environment it's going to run, and it's obsessed about how much time it has to get there. Well, when you and I live by those chemicals of survival, we become materialists. We become over-focused on our bodies. We obsess about body parts, what we look like, things we own in our environment, the people we know. We obsess about time. And those chemicals of stress are highly addictive. They cause a rush of energy in the body that wakes the brain and the body up to become heightened and aware for a very short period of time. So what happens is we begin to become addicted to these emotions so that we can feel some rush of energy in order to feel alive. And that rush of chemistry endorses the ego for us to over-focus on ourselves. And we begin to unconsciously use the circumstances, the conditions, the people in our life to reaffirm our addiction so that we can remember who we are as a somebody. Those chemicals create the emotions that we just talked about, from aggression to fear to guilt to shame to insecurity to unworthiness. Those are, according to the psychological model, 90% of how people think and act and feel are negative, and it's driven by those emotions. So, when we live, in a sense, by these survival emotions that are highly addictive, an interesting thing happens. The brain changes to the extent that we start functioning in beta wave patterns. And beta waves are your thinking brain. And when your beta waves get too high, you're overanalyzing. And in beta, the external world becomes more real than the internal world. In beta, you're a materialist defining reality by your senses, and you're trying to predict the next experience in order for you to survive in that circumstance. The unknown has no room to show up in your life when you're in that state. When you're in that state of creation that we talked about earlier with the frontal lobe, and you forget about yourself, and that forebrain begins to control the hindbrain, or your frontal lobe is cooling off the emotional centers and the rest of the automatic programs in the brain. Once the hardwired circuits and the chemistry are cooled off, and the thought becomes the experience, we could say that in the moment of creation, you forget about yourself. You forget about your identity. You become nobody. You become no thing. You become no time. And the moment you lose your associations to the environment, the body, and time, not only do nerve cells no longer fire together, no longer wire together, your old identity is beginning to become dismantled. But the survival centers that have been running in the lower part of the body, the adrenal centers and the sexual glands and all that stuff that has defined you because of how you think and feel, the moment the identity is off the throne, that energy in the body has to go somewhere, and it begins to move right to your heart. It begins to move right into that area, and you begin to fall in love with what you're creating. Now, this isn't a metaphysical concept. This is a physiological concept, because the moment you're no longer thinking and feeling as that same state of being or that same personality, and the identity is literally gone, you are nobody, no thing, no time, that emotional energy, remember, emotions are energy in motion, it literally begins to move to your heart, and you begin to feel expanded. You begin to feel connected to something greater. Whereas when you're living by those survival emotions, you feel separate from the field. You feel separate from something greater, and you're using your senses to try to always control an outcome. When you move into this wonderful moment where energy begins to change, and it's liberated out of the body, and you're feeling this elevated emotion, you're reconditioning your body to a new mind and new emotion, and your body is no longer living in the past, but in fact it's beginning to pull the anchor out of the past and see a whole new horizon in the future. And that energy then begins to rewrite the program that once determined who you were. And as that heart begins to open and you begin to feel that experience ahead of the event, you're signaling new genes in new ways. And your body now, as the unconscious mind, is believing that it's in that reality. And when you feel connected and you feel that elevated emotion and the body's free from its addiction because it's no longer believing that it's living in some past emotion unconsciously, the moment that that happens, you trust in the outcome. You no longer need your senses to define reality because you've already experienced it enough times. Now you don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. All you know is that it's going to happen. Now, the beauty behind all of this, the wonder and joy behind all of this, is that you can't be tickled, according to some of the latest research in tickling. You can't be tickled if you know where you're going to be tickled and when you're going to be tickled. It's impossible because tickling requires a surprise, an unexpected moment. And so think of this field of intelligence that's both personal within you and universal all around you. Everything, according to the quantum model, is made up of energy. As a matter of fact, 99.99999% of an atom is energy or empty nothing space, and 0.00001% of reality is physical substance particles. Isn't it funny we keep all our attention on that 0.00001%? When you move into this state of creation and you're focused on that 99.99999% of nothing, you're no longer a materialist. Now you are in a state where you are connected to something greater, and you allow this intelligence to begin to organize, and you surrender to the effects of it surprising you in one way to wake us up from this dream. And when that new experience creates a new emotion, and the energy that's associated with that new emotion then drives us, inspires us to want to do it again. And in that moment when we are consumed by that experience, we could look back at our entire life and we can see all the mistakes and all the things that we used to regret. And in that moment when something wonderful like this happens, we can look back at our whole entire past and we wouldn't want to change any aspect of it. We wouldn't want to change anything about it. We wouldn't even want to change a hair on a person's head in the present moment, in that moment, because it all led us to this wonderful state of grace. And when that happens, that's when the past begins to change and roll up into the present, and the body now is no longer anchored to the old personality that's connected to old emotions. We are now free to move into a new